Meaning of an event important enough to be called a Great Awakening has been of continued interest for evangelical historians. Beginning with the revival itself, we've wrestled through the questions of what transpired when many in the New World converted to a new brand of Protestantism called evangelicalism. Was this an act of God's Spirit who touched the lives of many and drew them to Christ in new birth? Or was this the product of religious enthusiasm? Harry Stout captures the problems involved in interpreting the awakening when he says, the series of mid-18th century religious revivals known as the Great Awakening have stimulated the historical interest of every generation. The causes and consequences of the revival have attracted and confounded students of each generation who hope to discover in the Great Awakening a key to unlocking the mysteries of colonial thought and society. As an essentially religious phenomenon, it compounds the typically muddied problem of historical causation by introducing into the debate questions regarding the limits of historical inference. The very spiritual catharsis, Stout says, inherent in the subject, imposed a certain simplicity on the earlier arguments over the revivals, and we'll see this. Evangelicals have indeed turned to the awakening to understand cultural mysteries, and there are these muddied problems of historical interpretation evident in the various approaches to the period. This, I think, has actually resulted in a kind of more a richer view of colonial revival, though it comes with great controversy. One problem that Professor Bebbington has observed is that since evangelicalism's founding, we've not always been interested in our own history, and this has at times impacted the quality of our historiography. It's not until the 60s that evangelicalism even became really an academic subject, and thus there's been this discrepancy with how we wrote about the past before and after this watershed decade. And so even as the term evangelicalism has been subjected to debate, the term historian is contested and can have a range of meaning. So for those who wrote before the 60s, who follow what John Howard Smith calls neo-Whig American historiography, they're historians, but they're not in the same sense of the academic historians writing since then. James Banner distinguishes between the discipline of history and then being a professional historian. So the early non-academic authors, and a number of them are still writing today, of this vein, it can indeed be described as historians, though they are not always using the methods of the professional guild. The evangelical historians examined in this lecture fall into both of Banner's categories, which represents problems in historical methodology and source interpretation and things like that. So we need to keep these problems in mind, which we'll do in this lecture as we focus on evangelical historians and how they've interpreted the First Great Awakening, both in New England and Nova Scotia. And we'll be focusing on representative histories from the colonial settlement to the late 20th century. The necessary place here to begin is obviously with Jonathan Edwards, whose writings shape subsequent revival narratives. The analysis will also consider two historians in the generations immediately following the revival, namely John Gillies and Joseph Tracy. Gillies wrote influential studies of revivalism, whereas Tracy, the guy who gives us the term Great Awakening, used it to describe New England religious identity. Both of them are very sympathetic to the awakening itself. We'll then move into the Victorian period, and we'll turn our focus to Luke Tyerman, who wrote a work on Whitefield, but this led him to view certain elements of the extremes of the awakening with a little bit more critical eye. He marks a shift, actually, that will develop into the 20th century as evangelicals will become more critical of the awakening's extremes. And Tyerman functions as a kind of catalyst, moving the narrative through the 19th and into the 20th century. Evangelical writing up to the mid-20th century did so from more of an admiring and defensive position. Academic historians after the 60s offered varied and objective accounts of the revival. And at the same time, those writing from what Mark Knoll calls a tribal perspective maintained a strong fidelity to the awakening and wrote more in the vein of a Gillies or a Tracy. But academic historians such as Edwin Gousted and Harry Stout that we'll be looking at represent an approach to the past that viewed the awakening through more critical historical lenses. Whereas lay historians like Arnold Dallimore exemplify that older, kind of more theologically driven approach. Though these are our representative historians, throughout the essay, I'm going to make recourse to various other scholars and interpretations from the differing perspectives. And W.R. Ward, in his wide-ranging study of evangelical revival, observed that, quote, the revival in New England has attracted far more scholarly attention than all the rest of the Protestant awakenings put together. His book, The Protestant Evangelical Awakening, helped set the revival in its larger European context, but did not discuss the impact that it had in the maritime colonies. Nova Scotia was an area deeply connected to New England, and the American revivalist Henry Alline had significant influence on this region and has rightly been the focus of Canadian interpretations of maritime awakening. The latter part of this essay then is going to consider the work of the Canadian evangelical historian George Rawlick, whose scholarship did much to shape our understanding of Protestantism in Eastern Canada. We begin with Jonathan Edwards. Revival obviously was a factor in colonial Puritan experience, such as those conducted under Solomon Stoddard in Massachusetts or Theodore Frelinghuysen in New Jersey. And yet these were not of the same historical consequence as those of a later generation. In 1734, revival is going to strike in Stoddard's town of Northampton, but through the ministry of his grandson, Jonathan Edwards. And though this lasted a short season, this revival that Thomas Kidd describes as the most influential revival in the history of evangelicalism becomes the catalyst for future awakenings and the paradigm for interpretations that are going to describe it as a single great awakening. The result for this is found in Edwards's use of print media to tell this story. So as you know, in the year following, his nascent interpretation of these events would blossom into a detailed analysis in his first revival work, The Faithful Narrative. The backstory is well known for historians. It began as an 8-page letter to the Boston clergyman Benjamin Coleman, who'd heard about the revival and hoped that this could be something of the beginning of a global harvest. He will turn to print media and then will correspond with those in his transatlantic network, particularly the Evangelicals in London, John Guise and Isaac Watts. These men were enthralled and requested of Edwards that he draw up a more detailed account for publication, which he does with The Faithful Narrative, which will go through a storied publication history, but is eventually published in London to great acclaim. Edwards had agreed to publish the report of the revival because he felt that it was, quote, his duty to declare this amazing work, as it appeared to me to be indeed divine, and to conceal no part of the glory of it. So this revival was promoted to the public consciousness and became a source of pan-evangelical unity, interpreting other disparate local revivals into a part of a more global phenomenon. And so the Faithful Narrative helped shape the idea of this single transatlantic awakening. Edwards is, of course, known as America's theologian and a great American philosopher, and yet his first published book dealt with history. Michael Haykin observed that The Faithful Narrative was unlike Edwards's later revival writings that offered an analysis of evangelical conversion, as he was, quote, primarily seeking to narrate what took place during the revival. Though Whitefield is described as the founder of the evangelical tradition, it was Edwards who began the historical documentation and theological defense which have sustained the awakening as an ongoing tradition. He did not pull from source material through any kind of documentary research, but used firsthand experience of the revival and his own statistical calculations, interpreting it as a genuine work of God and using it to develop his theology of revival. Edwards begins The Faithful Narrative with a history of his Northampton church and the awakening that happens in 1734. He observed that kind of drops of revival occurred in 1733, when he observed a kind of unusual flexibleness in Northampton's young people. Death among them had started them thinking about their eternal state, which prepared their hearts for the gospel. And this gospel seriousness would then spread to the adults. And Edwards would estimate that his church membership grew to 620, which was a large segment of the town's adult population. Product of Enlightenment epistemology, he gives scientific evidence for the genuineness of the conversions and detailed statistics, illustrating them with converts from his own congregation. He concludes the book on a tragic note with the sudden ending of the revival at the suicide of his uncle, who had suffered the disease of melancholy and ended up slitting his own throat, that Edwards would attribute to the work of Satan. His hope was to make this history usable in that stories of conversion might spur others in revival work. David Kling noted that The Faithful Narrative described and quantified the Great Awakening as a social event, in contrast to later works like Religious Affections that focused on individual religious experience. Kling referred to Edwards as the leader and explainer of America's Great Awakening. Though Willem van Vlaspen rightly called Edwards the theologian of awakening, he can also be described as the historian of awakening. And the faithful narrative stands as really the first historical account by an evangelical American chronicler that functions paradigmatically for what revival could be as a singular work of the Spirit. Through print, the Northampton revival could be communicated on a large scale and became the standard by which other revivalists would model their own revivals. It was significant. Wesley read it in 1738, not long after Aldersgate, and publishes an abridgment. And Whitefield goes to New England in 1740 and pays an emotional visit to Northampton because he had read it. And New Light clergy looked to Northampton for inspiration. Most of the 25 revival narratives printed in North America from 41 to 45 followed Edwards' model fairly closely. We turn now to John Gillies. Like Edwards, Whitefield used print media to publicize his revivals. And though Edwards was hesitant about self-promotion, Whitefield embraced becoming Anglo-America's first celebrity. As Frank Lambert argued, Whitefield used print media as part of his adaptation of commercial strategies. Whitefield's friend, William Seward, traveled with him and helped get his preaching schedule into British and American newspapers. And another friend who used print to publicize his revivals was John Gillies, a minister in the Church of Scotland at Blackfriars, Glasgow. Alongside his ministry, Gillies wrote history with a focus on Whitefield and revival. His most important work is probably the 2-volume Historical Collections of 1754, which was a comprehensive revivalist historiography that attempted to demonstrate the, quote, success of the gospel throughout history, beginning with the apostles down to the time of writing. Although David Carey Jones observes Gillies really only spends about 40 pages on the period before the Reformation, which is a kind of an immediatist perspective that is common amongst evangelicals. Whitefield's health had suffered in the 1750s, and so he had wanted to have kind of a control over his posthumous reputation, and so he commissions Gillies to curate that. And so in 1772, Gillies edits the 6 volumes of Whitefield's works. This consists of 3 volumes of sermons. Then there's a collection of major writings and about 1,500 letters, and Gillies' own authorized biography of Whitefield. Outside of preserving Whitefield's legacy, he wrote on a range of other topics, including his sermons, and Gillies even gives to us an illustrated version of Milton's Paradise Lost. So Gillies is one of the first historians of evangelicalism and revival, and the result of which, in the words of Jones, gave us historical contextualization and compelling evidence for their central role in God's activities in the world. One of his historical aims was grounded in the religious interest that he had in revival. He had political interests in America as well. He'd argued in the Kirk's General Assembly, though unsuccessfully, for a more conciliatory policy with the Patriots in 1776. But his focus in segments of historical collections was on the religious history of New England. In Volume 1, he argued that the spiritual condition of 17th century New England was one of growth due to missions work, like people from missionaries like John Eliot. And then he even focuses a little on what he calls the pious Indians who'd been converted to Christianity. He also gives some attention to the Mather family. In Volume 2, he then articulates a spiritual decline that's going to happen, what he calls a sad decay. This goes from 1705 to 1734, which then explains the need for revival. Of course, that closing date is important because that's the beginning of revival in Northampton under Edwards. What he calls an extraordinary revival in the British colonies in America. He goes beyond New England, traces revivals in the middle colonies, and then links them all together into one larger experience of an awakening. And his focus, though, is really going to sharpen on Whitefield, who arrives, of course, in the New World in 1740 with the hope of establishing an orphanage. In September, Whitefield conducts a remarkable revival in Boston, then gets taken over by Gilbert Tennant in December. And then Whitefield goes to Northampton to preach powerfully for Edwards. And so this volume continues then in minute detail of every place that Whitefield went, preaching to the throngs, experiencing opposition, and all the while establishing revival in its wake. What's most noticeable about Gillies' very detailed account is that while the data is compelled into a kind of a chronological, coherent timeline, Gillies himself does not offer much in the way of evaluation and analysis. It's as if just like the mere narration of the facts was enough to overwhelm the reader and convince them that this was a powerful work of God. As Jones rightly observed, Gillies functioned more like an editor than an author, selecting accounts that served his purposes and weaving them together to create this grand narrative of the progress of the gospel. And so the result is a kind of a flat depiction of Whitefield, who doesn't come across as a compelling character. Neither is he overly offensive. He more is just like a statistic. Gillies' emphasis on the effective mission work to the even indigenous peoples and the reviving of a declining church, along with this excruciating detail of Whitefield's travels, set the stage then for later historiography that will see the awakening as this act of God working in a dead culture through the ministrations of a great man. The work itself is indispensable for the heavy detail that it provides, but it is not enjoyable bedtime reading, shall we say. And one must keep in mind that all such works are necessarily selective in the material that is included or edited out, and that as comprehensive as it appears to be, it's actually limited by Gillies' own editorial revival agendas. Where he does appear in the text as a narrator, it's typically to answer criticisms, and we could go on with some of those, but I'll spare us. The hagiographical portrayal of Whitefield by Gillies then will shape later historians and offer little in the way of criticism. So we turn now to the Victorian era and Luke Tyerman. Before Arnold Dallimore published his 2-volume biography in the late 20th century, really the standard work of Whitefield was that by the Methodist historian Luke Tyerman, a Yorkshireman ordained into Methodist ministry, did that for about 20 years until ill health forced him out. And then he becomes one of the major Methodist historians of the Victorian period, wrote sizable biographies of leaders like John Wesley. I like what Robert Glenn calls that as a triple-decker Victorian biography, as well as others like John Fletcher, and then, of course, Whitefield. Tyerman's historical interests surrounded really the Evangelical revival in England, but his 2 volumes on Whitefield meant that he had to deal with the Great Awakening. Tyerman wrote when Methodism was undergoing significant growth in England, and so Martin Wellings argues that Tyerman's lifetime then coincided with the numerical expansion and institutional consolidation of the Wesleyan connection. This provided substantial readership as Methodists were turning to his work to understand their own denomination's history. This is the period of Victorian biography, which is a period of biographical innovation, and so Tyerman turns to a genre that is becoming well established in the literary and publishing world, and he used his history to further his denominational agenda, both as a means of edification and as a weapon in controversy. Tyerman justifies publishing this 1,200-page biography of Whitefield because though he's very biased towards Wesley, one couldn't understand the Methodists without understanding Whitefield. Though John is the founder, Charles the hymn writer, others play key roles, Whitefield is preeminently what he calls the outdoor preacher. Though Gillies provided a first-hand account of Whitefield's revivalism, his historiography is going to be very limited. Tyerman expands on Whitefield's life through research in a way that Gillies could not do. He claimed, I believe there is now no information concerning Whitefield of any public importance which is not contained in these present volumes. As Whitefield was a Methodist, and because Tyerman writes to defend the Methodists, it's hard for him to be critical of the itinerant as much as he might have liked to. He freely admitted in a preface to his biography that Whitefield was a Calvinist, I am an Arminian. And yet, nevertheless, he claims objectivity, not attempting to, quote, refute Whitefield's theological agenda. Frederick Grier notes, though, that Tyerman was a man who was second to none in his admiration of Wesley's merits. And it's evident that Tyerman favored Wesley and used Whitefield as a foil, even admitting that his biography was a byproduct of his research on Wesley. Though he tolerates Whitefield's Calvinism to a degree, Tyerman is not flattering, questioning, quote, whether Whitefield ever fully understood the Calvinism which he preached, claiming that to the end of his life, his theological erudition was comparatively small. So for Tyerman, Wesley's the true force behind revival, and Whitefield, though gifted, is just simply a preacher. Like Gillies, Tyerman's work is Herculean. but very hard to read because of, again, the vast amount of information within the book. And thus, sober Tyerman, as J.I. Packer called him, offers mainly narrative without much in the way of analysis or commentary, but beyond simple summaries. Also, like Gillies, there's this problem with source selection and editing. Often Tyerman would summarize a source, but make it look like it was verbatim, leaving the reader in the dark as to what the original said. He's also selective in what he includes or what he leaves out, with such a strong Wesleyan bent. He's not always trustworthy when it comes to his presentation of Whitefield. He claimed objectivity, a simple presentation of the facts, but his biography of Whitefield is, he claimed, never artistic or philosophic. It wasn't the place, he said, for historians to intervene with opinions and judgments. Yet, nevertheless, his anti-Calvinism and the critiques, the subtle critiques of Whitefield are apparent, as well as his really strong bias against the Church of England, the Oxford movement, in favor of Methodism. Joseph Tracy. Awakening was a term that was used to describe God's work in the hearts of sinners in early colonial America, and became something of a key term that will lead into the evangelical period. And so over time, the revival will become known in American religious history as the Great Awakening. The term Great Awakening is actually first used to describe what happened in New England at this time by the Congregationalist clergyman Joseph Tracy, who coins this term for usage in his 1841 book of the same name. So he is born in Vermont, he trains at Dartmouth, teaches for a time in New York and in Vermont, both states. He is a new divinity theologian. He gets ordained into ministry, but pastors only a time from 1821 to 29. He'll spend time as an editor of various periodicals. And then he becomes the secretary, both initially for the Massachusetts Colonization Society, and then he's the director of the American Colonization Society, which is wrestling through the question of what should they do with freed Black Africans. And so his work was actually involved in trying to. He argues for a kind of a gradual emancipation. He has a sermon in 1833 where he argues for the full value and dignity of all people, including Africans. But he thinks that it's a kind of Jacobin notion to do an immediate emancipation. So he wants is a gradual emancipation. He can educate these freed slaves and then actually return them back to Africa. And so he's going to be involved with the work of colonization in Liberia, including the founding of Liberia College. He's going to write histories on this whole movement, and then connecting it even to missions. He'll even do a map for missions. He will eventually then die 1874 in Beverly, Massachusetts. He writes The Great Awakening, he says, to provide historical support for America's 19th century revivals. And so his volume has interpretive significance, marks a development from Edwards, who writes theologically from within the Awakening, to academically researched history. Like Tyerman, he's a precursor to later academic development and used a broad sampling of documents from the Awakening that he worked into a coherent and accomplished narrative. His history was written from the perspective of Edwards's theological inheritors, the new divinity, and so this helps develop a kind of Edwardsian historiography, which has its own theological agendas. For Edwards, his theology was at the forefront of his interpretation of the Spirit's work in revival. And so providential historiography is going to be a very key interpretive tool. Tracy, following in that trajectory, is going to forefront social history to a degree. And theological reflection is very evident, but it's not as explicit as in Edwards. And so providential history is used then more in the service of theology, but history itself becomes much more formal. The centenary of the Awakening is the occasion for his writing, which he thinks is necessary because no commemoration had yet been written. Clergy had debated the truthfulness, the veracity of the Awakening, and so what Tracy wants to do is he wants to moderate the enthusiastic extremes. These are evident, he says, there was evident need of a work which would furnish the means of suitably appreciating both the good and the evil of that period of religious history. And he's writing within the context of the Second Great Awakening and the enthusiasm of Charles Finney. Finney, of course, claiming to be an inheritor of Edwards. It's interesting that Tracy will actually criticize Edwards for not being critical enough of enthusiasm. So with this need for the work established, Tracy asks then whether or not there's available source material. And he says a slight investigation is sufficient to furnish an answer. And so he's going to note things like the amount of materials that are in various libraries. He's going to make great use of Thomas Prince's The Christian History, which was contested in Prince's day. But nevertheless, Thomas Glegg calls it the most important cultural artifact of 18th century revivalism in New England. And this will afford Tracy access to letters by clergy who supported the revival. And then from his understanding, this was an entirely reliable work. He actually discovers a second volume of it that nobody had known about, that was in the Athenaeum in Boston, as well as in the Massachusetts Historical Society. And he believed that Prince could actually go a little too far in promoting enthusiasm, so he wanted to check that. Like the faithful narrative, the Christian history linked local accounts into a larger story, single intercolonial revival. And as Prince's account was published in Britain, created an even larger narrative, that of a transatlantic revival. Tracy sourced Whitfield's published journals, recognizing that they're varying editions, and he actually wants to use the earlier ones because of the lack of sufficient care that Whitfield had used in his reporting of revivals. He thinks this is a more important source that way. He's going to use critics of the revival like Chauncey's Seasonable Thoughts, and then he's going to pillage libraries, Massachusetts Historical Society, for newspapers, church and town records. He's going to look at histories by Backus and Hodge and Trumbull, and then other biographies like those of revivalists such as Samuel Buell or Gilbert Tennant, Eleazar Wheelock. And he's also going to use Gillies and his biography of Whitfield, along with that by Robert Phillip. The multifarious documents, he said, were enough to show that the period of the Great Awakening needed to be carefully studied, that some great idea was then extensively at work, breaking up established and venerated habits of thoughts, feeling, and action, and producing a revolution in the minds of men, and thus in the very structure of society. He'll follow the interpretation of Edwards. It was apparent that the colonial revivals were indeed part of one unified awakening. And this is going to comport with Tracy's idea of what he calls the first work of the historian, which is to seize that great idea. And so that great idea for him is this one singular awakening. But he's going to use the awakening to give us lessons, both good, the positives, as well as the negatives. And he's going to speak of these proper lessons, both of encouragement and warning. And so this is a usable past, and it's structured chronologically, beginning with a negative description of New England religion before the revival, and as well as descriptions of revival in New Jersey that are going to be a precursor. The core is going to focus on Whitfield, who's going to get 7 chapters. Edwards gets 4. The New Light enthusiast, James Davenport, is going to get 1, which is written as this kind of warning against revivalist extremes. Noting the controversy that the awakening sparked in its own day, he evaluates then the debates that are going to rage over it in Connecticut and Massachusetts. And then his final chapter is on the expansion of the awakening as it goes south into the southern colonies. Though it's noteworthy that he doesn't look north to Canada, nor does he look at Nova Scotia. His book, The Great Awakening, is still in print through Banner of Truth, and it's used by historians across historiographical perspectives. This is due to his source material and the way that he draws his interpretation to conclude that disparate local revivals are part of a unified Great Awakening. Robert Brockway observed that to date, Tracy's remains one of the few comprehensive discussions of the Great Awakening. In their bibliographies, most historians continue to recommend Tracy's work as a useful source. Although Tracy wrote his book from the evangelical point of view, it has dominated historical interpretations of the Great Awakening from his own time down to the 1980s and 1990s. It's not without critics, notably John Butler, who argued against there being one singular revival that could be called a Great Awakening. Butler includes Tracy in his argument that the Great Awakening is an interpretive fiction, and his concern is with the enthusiasm of the awakening. It's funny, though, that if you think about it, Tracy shares Butler's concerns, and he aligns himself with the critics within the Edwardsian moderate New Light tradition, and he doesn't like the radicals like Davenport. Let's move into the 20th century now, and we're going to begin with Edwin Gousted. Historiography of the awakening starts to change with the rise of history as a profession and the methods that will come with that, and so evangelical historians start to make use of these. to deepen their understanding of social causes that shaped the revival. And so an important historian to consider in this regard is Edwin Gausted, who taught at the University of California, Riverside. He was born in Iowa, raised in Texas, serves in the Second World War, studied at Baylor, did a PhD under Edmund Morgan at Brown in Rhode Island in 51, and he teaches there for a bit, has some teaching stints at the University in Georgia, Rome, Georgia, as well as at the University of Redlands in California. But then he'll join the faculty at University of California, Riverside in 65, where he'll stay until his retirement. Interestingly, he was called as an expert witness in a famous trial of 2002 against the Alabama Justice Roy Moore, who had surreptitiously put the Ten Commandments up in front of the state's courthouse. So the ACLU and others brought charges against him, and Gausted actually testified on their behalf. And he reflects really here the principles that were in line with the Rhode Island Baptist Roger Williams, who he wrote a biography of. Gausted stated, I would say that the American founders would believe this monument is an unconstitutional establishment of religion. It seems to promote public piety and endorses the Judeo-Christian God. One reason for his influence is that he wrote general works on American religious history. So he's got his Historical Atlas of Religion in America, Religious History of America, Dissent in American Religion. I like what Professor Knoll said of Gausted's atlas, saying that it literally put religion on the map. And Harvard historian Lee Eric Schmidt eulogized Gausted, calling him a geographer of American religion. His work often dealt with this vexed question of the relationship between church and state in the burgeoning New Republic, examining the religious lives of radical figures in early America, like Williams. He also deals with Thomas Jefferson. Continuing with his own interests in his own Baptist denomination, he writes on Obadiah Holmes. And here you can actually see his Baptist political theology on full display, as his perspective, I think, shapes his work. I think he's got kind of like that kind of a Lockean view of religious toleration that's going to impact his views. His book, The Great Awakening in New England of 1957, is really the first major study to appear in 100 years. And though written in the mid-20th century, it actually still is consulted by scholars today. Guelzo describes it as the finest single-volume local study of the Awakening. And though it reads like a standard academic work from today, it has a bit of a literary flair to it. And a very close reading of it shows, I think, that there are sympathies there that he has with the original framers of the revival. And how they told their story. He could describe the revival as a phenomenon as wondrous as it was inexplicable, and that there was no revival technique behind it. It was rather, he said, a kind of extraordinary outpouring of God's Spirit. Why a revival would start or stop was up to the mysterious workings of the Holy Spirit, who moved as he pleased. Gausted also took seriously the notion of spiritual decay as a kind of precondition for awakening, against other social causes. The earlier Puritans had expressed deep concern for the spiritual decay of society, and under the preaching of men like Stoddart, revival would come. So he looks at it as kind of like, under Stoddart, you've got like a period of wetness. Edwards' 1734 revival is more like a stream, and then the deluge comes in the 1740s under Whitefield. Gausted argued that though the Northampton revival was local, it had connections with others in the region, and even outside of Massachusetts. And this could happen because of word-of-mouth transition of revival across these regions. And he's aware that social causes could be behind the revival. He notes the epidemic of throat distemper that had raged at this time and killed many in New England. But he actually argues this is not the cause of revival, because the epidemic had struck in New Jersey in 1735, a year after Edwards' 1734 revival. So the revival is already underway by the time epidemic strikes. It was also more intense in other regions, but it didn't seem to affect the intensity of revival there. He gives credence to a quotation from Guise and Watts in their preface to the Faithful Narrative, who'd argued against there being any sudden distressing calamity that might universally impress the minds of a people. And he claimed the trustworthiness of a statement made by men across the Atlantic because there existed what he said was an Anglo-American community that often made London more familiar than Charleston, South Carolina, with what might be happening in and around Massachusetts Bay. I find this to be a surprising statement, given the fact that Guise and Watts famously mistook Hampshire County for New Hampshire. And this questions, I think, some of the reliability of their knowledge of the area. Even Edwards himself was frustrated by this. But nevertheless, the 1734 revival is not general, as it only rippled into other areas slowly. So Gausted actually sees it as a precursor to what's going to come under Whitefield in the 1740s. There's a connection between Whitefield and Northampton in the revival work of others like Tennant and Jonathan Dixon in the Middle Colonies. And so these and revivalists in other places in Massachusetts get linked together with the coming of Whitefield into a Great Awakening. He frames Whitefield's ministry in New England alongside Tennant and Davenport, and writes as though taking their side in the controversies against guys like Chauncey, whom he describes as enemies. And so he doesn't really take into consideration the disruption that people like a Davenport would bring to colonial society. Gelzo describes Gausted's writing as more academically aloof and historicized, which it was in relation to providential historians who wrote, but it's not entirely the case that his religious proclivities were kept at bay. In the case of his biographies or Williams or Holmes, you see his Baptist principles shaping his historiography, where he sympathizes also with the Awakening and the revivalists involved in it. That's apparent with a careful read. Nevertheless, his contribution to the subject is significant, and he carried the trajectory of academic historiography forward for later evangelicals like Harry Stout, who we're now going to consider. Harry Stout, key member of a cadre of scholars who accept the standards of the professional guild. He teaches at Yale. Jonathan Edwards, professor of American history. He's the editor of the works of Jonathan Edwards. He did his PhD in religious history at Kent State. Before teaching at Yale, he was at the University of Connecticut. And Stout's book, The New England Soul, really amplifies what might be latent within the earlier approach, even of somebody like Tracy, wherein he only uses the tools of social history to understand the Awakening, and he doesn't make appeals to providence. The book focuses on preaching in New England to provide a window into the social conditions of the time. Stout calculated the average weekly churchgoer listened to something like 7,000 sermons in a lifetime, totaling somewhere between 15,000 hours of concentrated listening. There's no competing messages, and so the sermon is really the only regular voice of authority at the time. Stout was wise to consult not just printed sermons, which had this eye, towards publication, but he also looks at unpublished manuscripts, which has a much less polished presentation. And so he had spent countless hours reading through these 2,000 manuscripts, 9 years pillaging archives. And what he discovered was that there was a continuity in sermon substance between the colonial Puritan preaching and that of evangelicalism, which is going to nuance the explanation of societal decay before the revival. And he noted that models of secularization stem from historians' failure to appreciate the functional distinctions made by colonial ministers between regular Sabbath preaching and occasional weekday sermons. And so he's going to say that, Sabbath preaching was always consistent in terms of its biblical exposition. Occasional sermons could have a wide range of topics, both political and religious, but even they are consistently otherworldly. And so he doesn't want to conflate these different types of preachings, but wants to get a more holistic picture of America before the Revolution. Stout argued that everything changed for preaching when Whitefield arrived in New England in 1740. Until then, society is ordered with respect to clerical authority. Ministers have standing. Parishioners took seriously the messages that they heard. And Whitefield's itinerancy will come in and trigger a social fragmentation and then the contributing loss to this authority. So awakening happened not because the itinerant came into a context of secularization and decay, reviving a nation, but because rapid demographic growth and economic development was changing New England society. And the balance of colonial New England gave way to these extremes, especially with the rise of Enlightenment individualism, which will connect well with revivalistic notions of individualism. And so many think that the societal chaos of the time was a moral problem of the soul, making revival necessary. But the effect is revival actually brings more social chaos. And Edwards, he assumes in 1734 that healing was going to come because of revival, and it actually results in greater discord. And so Edwards' revival narrative of a unified work of the Spirit actually connects problems that the revival brought into a larger network instead of containing them into a locality like Northampton. The colonies of New England were most receptive to Whitfield's revivalism when compared to others. On his first tour, he preaches 175 sermons to great acclaim because his simple, not overly theological messages were performed with great affect. They were not like the sermons of the clergy, which were more carefully written theological treatises. Instead, he preached extemporaneously, lots of drama, bordering on melodrama. This results in a demand for a new kind of preaching because of the nature of his itinerancy. He could preach the same sermon many times because he moved locales and was able to commit simple messages to memory that crafts his oratory to scintillate auditors, which they weren't hearing within their own congregations, and becomes something of a spectacle. Whitfield moved on his tours, and other revival preachers would take his place, and then you get the rise of preaching against unconverted ministers and people like Gilbert Tennant and Davenport, who stoke revivalist enthusiasm that continues to upend society. This attention to social conditions marks Stout's outlook and makes him indispensable for understanding the world that Whitfield enters into. Arnold Dallimore, who we'll consider next, does not like the work of Stout, especially the Divine Dramatist, Stout's biography of Whitfield. Dallimore takes very much more that kind of providential interpretation that will front-load theology and an understanding of the role of the Spirit. And that will mark his massive, 2-volume biography. Dallimore, he was a Canadian writing in the 20th century, the late 20th century, does a massive Banner of Truth biography. Takes him 30 years to write. He's actually the subject of my doctoral work. He had studied where I went to school, Toronto Baptist Seminary. He was there in the 1930s and was one of the founders of the Fellowship of Evangelical Baptists in Canada, that a denomination I'm actually ordained in. The reason for his writing this Whitfield biography was that he'd just lived in poverty, and he thought it was actually a good way of making money. And so through his friendships with people like Ian Murray and Martin Lloyd-Jones, he will come to write kind of the almost the definitive modern biography of Whitfield. It's been accused of hagiography, and so part of my work was actually to kind of like push back a little bit on that accusation. He writes filiopietistic history, there's no doubt about it. But he's critical of Whitfield. He's kind of like the opposite of Tyerman in a sense. Tyerman is pro-Wesley, anti-Whitfield, and Dallimore himself is anti-Wesley and pro-Whitfield, and that will shape his writing, but not to the degree that he's willing to not take into account things like Whitfield's problems with slavery. He's not as good as Thomas Kidd on this. Kidd's biography does a very good job on Whitfield and slavery. But nevertheless, Dallimore is going to recognize this, as well as problems with Whitfield's ego. But for sure, for Dallimore, Whitfield is the key man behind the Great Awakening, which was a unified transatlantic event, and something that we need revival for today. Quickly, George Rollick, who's another Canadian historian, he's writing at the same time as Dallimore, and yet in a much more academic sort of way. George Rollick, the late George Rollick, taught at the King's University in Kingston. Queen's University in Kingston. He had taken a PhD at the University of Rochester in New York, taught in various other universities throughout the Maritimes. His scholarly output was prodigious. He authors and edits over 30 books and countless academic articles on Canadian evangelicalism, edits a series with McGill Queen's University Press. And though he writes within Canada, he's got relationships with historians in the United States. He's a part of the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals at Wheaton and edits volumes with professors Bebbington and Knoll, and even got a Pew Charitable Grant to study religion and public life in Canada. He studied Canadian evangelicalism more broadly, but he really focused in as well on maritime Baptists and revival in the 18th century, with an emphasis on Henry Align, the so-called Whitfield of Nova Scotia. And Rollick wrote a major study of Canadian revival, with the opening 2 chapters dedicated to Align. He also edited a collection of Align's letters and hymnody, published a major study of Align's life and revivalism called Ravished by the Spirit in 1984. He kind of follows in the train of another historian, it's Simon Fraser, J.M. Bumstead, who wrote kind of the definitive biography of Align, but Rollock's going to critique it, not thinking that Align is this great intellectual literary giant as Bumstead had called him. Rather, Rollock demonstrates that Align, though a fascinating figure, was not theologically astute, nor was he a particularly great writer. Align was an American. He was born in Newport, Rhode Island in 1748, came to Nova Scotia with his family just before the Revolution. He had a very mystical conversion experience of Christ that was actually studied by William James in the Varieties of Religious Experience. This conversion delights his family, and then he'll begin an itinerant preaching ministry throughout Nova Scotia, very similar to Whitefield in New England, which Align will do this through from 1775 to 83. And then he returns to America, to New Hampshire, where he will die in Hampton in 1784. Align was a New Light revivalist who stressed religious experience over theological precision, often decrying what he thought was the arid theology of Calvinism. And so he's an Arminian, very hostile to Calvinism, and he actually holds heterodox views on key issues like original sin. But like Calvinist Whitefield, he was a powerful orator and amassed a large following. Curiously, though he was critical of Calvinism and practiced paedobaptism, a byproduct of his revivalism was actually the birth of the Calvinistic Baptist denomination in the Maritimes. Align's ministerial emphasis is kind of as a saddlebag preacher, not a writer, but he did publish one theological work, which is problematic. It's called The Two Mites, published in 1781. It deals with the much disputed points of divinity, where his theological views are on display, especially his anti-Calvinism. At the beginning of the Great Awakening in Nova Scotia, it was much later than that in New England, and really can be dated to when Align commenced his itinerancy. He was, in Rollock's words, a man almost larger than life, and he cast a long shadow over the religious development of the New England, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick region into the present day. He was the one who was ravished by the Spirit, a phrase and its cognates that Rollock regularly picked up on. And Align's influence was incalculable. Rollock said that he left behind him scores of disciples, hundreds of followers, and a spiritual legacy reflected in both the oral and written tradition of the religious culture of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Though the numbers might be less, Rollock's influence on evangelical historiography in Canada was likewise significant. To conclude here, I'm just over time. The English historian E.P. Thompson once observed that revivalism is not a phenomenon which admits of a single hold-all explanation. And we've seen this in the sampling of evangelical historians and their various positions on the revival itself. Michael McClyman has observed that it seems that revivalism is a phenomenon that cannot be reduced to a single causal factor, and that economic circumstances provide little help in explaining the ebb and flow of religious interest. And so he's going to lean into a little bit more theology. And so what I'm basically kind of arguing here in this conclusion is that I actually think that we need all of these approaches. I think we need good historiography. We need to deal well with the sources. We need social history. I think the work of people like Harry Stout is absolutely indispensable. He's so helpful in understanding the sociological causes and then the problems that can come with that in terms of understanding past events. But I do think that we also need theology in our understanding of history. These are two separate methods, the science of history and the science of theology, and both of them are helpful in trying to get us to a holistic approach to past events like a Great Awakening. And depending on who we're writing for, we might lean one way or another. If I'm writing for the academy, I'm really going to kind of lean into the more stout approach that has that social history as the kind of foundation for it. If I'm writing for the church, though, to understand God's movements in history is a real encouragement to Christians, and I think that's entirely appropriate. And so what Andrew Atherstone has argued in the context of debates over providential historiography, he says that evangelicals need to embrace both styles of writing. They're helpful historical pursuits, both of them. And then there's a kind of a balance that we can strike, a mean between the two. Professional historians help us engage with sociological elements, whereas providential historians are sensitive to these theological categories. And I think together they can provide a more robust interpretation of a very mysterious event like a revival.